Hi everyone, this is Patrick Wolf, and I wanted to take a quick few minutes today and go through how to integrate CloudBees Core and Jenkins with the new binary authorization available on GCP with Google Kubernetes Engine to actually ensure compliance and security when you're rolling out containers onto your production systems. So with that, I've actually created a very simple application based on the Pet Clinic app, the Java app that I'm going to roll in production. I'm also going to use it in my development environment. And this is all self-contained in a repo called bdemo binary authorization demo, which is available publicly for anyone to go in and fork that if they want to. So with that, I'm going to fork this into my own GitHub account and then start working from there first. So I'm going to click on fork here, fork this into my own personal account. And now as soon as that's forked, I've got this available to me. I'm going to clone this real quick. So all these files in the setup directory here for this demonstration are available to set up everything you need in GCP for that. Before you begin, you will need at least one cluster running within GCP. This doesn't create a cluster for you. And you also need to have a GCP project that you can actually play around with. So the first thing I want to do is modify my configuration file. So my configuration file actually contains everything I need that's specific to my implementation. So I want to put in my CloudBees project ID. This is where I'm running Jenkins or my CloudBees Core product within GCP on a GKE cluster. And it is meant for a GKE cluster. This is not built for standalone Jenkins or standalone CloudBees Core. It is pretty much set for Kubernetes for that. The deployer project ID is where I want to deploy that to, and that could be the same project, could be a different project. It's pretty much set up where you can have one project for this, for everything, but you would want to have a separate cluster, one for Jenkins and one for where you're deploying this. And ideally, you could probably have one for testing with a production deploy versus a dev deploy. For that. So the attester project is where you're storing your attestations of someone signing off that this container is good to go to the next level. Again, that can be the same project where you have it now or where you're running Jenkins and where you're running your deployments, but in a real world you want to have that as a separate project. It's going to be available to any other project to go through and see those attesters. So you don't have to set up attesters in every project. Again, you have to set up the CloudBees cluster where you're actually running that, the namespace where CloudBees is running, and we do need to know the zone where this is running for the CloudBees cluster. Same thing for the deployer. For the dev cluster, we need to know where this is going to be running in dev, the name of the cluster. And I'll show you what mine are in a minute. I've just got dev and prod for this in the same project. And again, we need to know the cluster zone, the production cluster name, and the production cluster zone. There are optional changes you can make below, but again, these are things that I've preset. You don't have to set them if you don't want to, and can just run through with whatever you have available there, what's available for this. This will generate all of the keys and everything and clean those up for you once it's done. Now that I've changed my configuration file, I want to run this setup program to set everything up for me within GCP. And I'm actually going to set this up with two different projects, one for my tester and where I'm running CloudBees, and the other for where I'm deploying this to, just for the sake of showing that it is possible to do that. Again, they can all be the same project if you want to have just one project to play around in. So everything that this setup script is doing is basically taking everything that's in the documentation for binary authorization that was created by Google and going through step by step and generating all of the commands, generating the keys for that. You can see it's creating the public key, private key for that. And it's going to create a service account that I'm going to use from within my Jenkins job to do everything for me, such as push containers, publish my app, everything I needed to do on my behalf. So I'm generating a service account just called CloudBees Service Account for that. And I did try to create with the minimum permissions possible to do everything in this app for that. So now that that's done, I've actually generated in that. If I go up a level, we'll be able to see that I've actually created a Jenkins file here now. And this Jenkins file has everything set up for me for where my attester is, where my deployers are, for my dev and my prod. Everything's been filled in for that. Where my secrets are going to be located. This is all part of the environment variables of the Jenkins pipeline. So everything is pre-baked into this pipeline with environment variables and running through. And I'll show in a minute when I run this. So I'm actually doing a Maven build. I'm going to create my dev branch using Canico, which builds Docker containers within Docker. I'm going to attest the branch image with my branch or my build attester just to attest that it's been built correctly. And then it's actually going to skip the other two. And I'll get into that in a minute with whether it's building a tag or not for my releases. So I'm going to jump out of this. And now that everything's been built, I've got everything ready to go. I want to actually commit this back to my repository and then start running this application. So I've pushed this back to my repository. So now I'm going to jump back into my browser here, do a refresh on this. And now I've got my latest commit for that. So before that, I'm going to back up a second and go into my setup here within GCP. I've got dev and prod, both clusters here that I've got running, one for my development work, one for my production. And if you look right now, there's nothing running on these. There's no workloads on those clusters. So I'm going to jump to my other project real quick. And from this project, I'm running CloudBeast Core, and I've got my teams there. But what I wanted to show real quick is actually my attesters. So if I go to binary authorization, I've created two attesters here. One is a build attester to test that the build has been done successfully for that container. And the other is to attest that a tag has been created for that. And I'll show that in a second with a release tag from GitHub for this. So how that gets applied, I'm going to go back into where my deployment is and build a policy. Now you can see there's no attesters in this project. They're actually in the other project. Go to my policy, and my policy right now, I've got actually set up here. The project default rule, let me refresh this and edit it. If we go into this real quick. So I'm only allowing images from the following attesters for any project by default. This is the project default rule. So this is any cluster. I can't push images unless they've been signed by the build attester, and that wouldn't exist in the other project. That doesn't apply to the tag attester or anything like that. This is only for baseline. It has to be signed by that user. I've also got a, if I put this in here, for my production, I'm building two attesters that need to be there. I have to have a build attester sign off on this container and the tag attester sign off on this container. So I've got two levels for signatures that have to be there before this container can go into production. I can have more than that. I can have multiple attesters chained together on this, and they all have to be present before that container can go into, or that image can go into production system for that. So that's how things are set up within GCP. So now that I've got that application ready to go and ready and my system ready for everything that I want to set up, I'm going to go into Jenkins and start doing a build of this application to show where it goes and how it gets deployed. So when I go into CloudBeast Core here, you can see that I've got two teams available, one for Pet Clinic and one for the release team. So I'm going to go into my Pet Clinic team real quick. And you can see I don't have any pipelines set up. And I'm going to set up a pipeline for that repo that we just moved over in a clone. So I need to create a GitHub personal access token here. So I'm going to put that in real quick. And that's going to give me access to my repos. Choose the repo that I want. I'm going to choose my binary authorization demo that I've just created. And I'm going to create a pipeline. And this is going to look for that Jenkins file that's in the root directory of that by default. And find that repository, or find that Jenkins file for me and create a pipeline based on that. For Pet Clinic, I don't have any pipelines yet, so I want to create a new pipeline based on the Jenkins file that I just created with the setup. So I'm going to click on Create New Pipeline, go to GitHub, choose my account here, and then choose Binary Authorization Demo. Create pipeline. This is going to find the Jenkins file in the root of that was created and automatically start running this application for me to make this pipeline and to do all the stages in that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this. So now that's kicked off my pipeline, the first thing it's going to do, as I said before, it's going to do a clean install on Maven, run through all the tests, make sure that works, and generate the jar file for me, which I'm going to then put into a container and have that container built and put out into my Kubernetes cluster. So now that Maven's done with the build, the next step is going to actually use Canico, which is a Google tool for building containers within Docker. So you're not stuck doing Docker in Docker or doing sidecars or anything like that. It's actually going to build this container for me just like a Docker build would, and then push that to my GCR registry that I've set up for this, which is in my deployment project in this case. So you can see it's actually attested for this, which means it signed that manifest. Attestation created by this build attester for this image. So I'm going to copy this image digest real quick because I'm going to use it again in a second. And you can see it's actually taken that and deployed that dev branch into my development cluster. I'm going to take this and copy this as well. If I pull this up into a browser, now I've got Pet Clinic up and running on my development environment on this Kubernetes cluster. So now if we go back to my Kubernetes engine, look at this now. If I go into my workloads, you can see that on my dev cluster, I'm running Pet Clinic deploy with my deployment. Status is okay, everything's up and running just fine. So one thing I do want to show real quick now, because that's in the dev cluster, and I didn't put a policy on that, but I did put a policy on my production cluster. So let me go ahead and connect to that production cluster real quick. And what I want to try to do here is actually deploy this into production without having that signed off at all. So I'm going to take that same image that I just created and deployed in development and try to deploy that into production here. So I'm just going to do cube cuddle run Pet Clinic prod image, and this is where I want to put in the image that I just signed off on. And remember, I did sign off on this, but only from the build attester, not from the release or the tag attester for that. So now if I try to push this out into production, it's going to tell me that deployment was created. It doesn't tell me that the deployment was successful or not. So let me go ahead and close this down real quick. Go to my workloads. And you can see that it was forbidden to go into production. This was not signed off on. This image or this container has been blocked. It's denied by this attestation policy and authority. So I'm not going to be able to push that into production. No matter who I am or what I've done, I cannot push this into production because it hasn't been signed off on yet. It's fine for development, but not for production. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this deployment real quick, just so I don't want to cluttering up anything. So now I've deleted that. I'm only running in development. One other thing to mention, let me go back to my deployments again. If you notice the namespace here for master, I'm not going to go into this right now. You can do it on your own. But for each branch in your repository, the pipeline is set up to create a different namespace to run in for each of those branches. So if I've got 5 developers working on the same repository with PRs or with different feature branches or anything like that, they're all going to be generated a different namespace based on this pipeline. And this is in the Jenkins file in the deployment script that I've created for that. So it'll automatically handle conflict like that. So if a development cluster can handle multiple users across that, all in their own namespaces for whatever they're working on for that. So it is a little bit compartmentalized that way. And again, none of those can touch production. They can only deploy to the development cluster for that. It's based on the cluster, not on the namespace for that. So now if I want to actually go and push this into production, I've actually created this, I've done my development, I've done my PRs and everything. At least in this example, there are other ways to do this. Whatever your workflow is, it'll work with this. This is the one I chose to do just for demonstrations. I'm going to create a release within GitHub. There are no releases right now. I'm going to create a new release. I'm going to put a tag on this, version 1.0, my first release. Ready for production. Go ahead and publish this. This creates a release in GitHub, so it will tag that. It also creates a tag here within my repository called v1.0. And then also, if I go back here into my Jenkins, so now I go into my branches, you can see I've got a version 1.0 here because it is finding tags. You do need to turn on finding tags within this repo, but once that's done, it's going to find this tag and it's going to start building that. Let me open this up and we can watch what's going on here in this pipeline. So this is using the same Jenkins file, but it's actually branching off and doing a different segment of the Jenkins file for this pipeline. So you can see it skipped the Maven build, the creating the dev branch, the testing, and deploying the dev branch, and it's going right to adding a tag to the image. And what this is doing is adding that v.1 tag to the same image, so I can tell which images have tags and which ones are just normal production, or sorry, development images within my GCR. It's going to test for that tagged image, which means that it's going to sign it a second time. So it's the same image. I'm adding a tag to it, and then I'm going to sign it a second time. And you can see this one's actually done by a different attester, which is the tag attester for this image. And that means when I go to my release, it's actually rolling this out into my production system. And there I have it running in production. So if we want to go back and verify this, if I go into my workloads here, I've got my deploy running in production and I've got my deploy running in dev. They both happen to be running the same image. It's just that for production now, it has both signatures required before that can actually move into production. So with that, there are many ways you could set this up within Jenkins with an input statement, with Jenkins credentials to have that, with different people to sign off, whether they're QA, security, anybody in the organization that wants to sign off on a container before it moves into production can easily be done within GCP with this new feature set in place to do that. And it works very well with the Jenkins pipeline. And you can take what I've done here and adapt it to your own needs, or you can just play around with it directly as I have it within my repository. Just fork it and play around with it as much as you like. So with that, I hope this works for you, and enjoy it.